Before proceeding, viewers are advised to exercise caution. The following is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. This is a verbatim reproduction of testimony in federal court in the case of Sean Diddy Combs, as reported by Inner City Press. The courtroom was so quiet that you could hear someone blink. People sat with bated breath, their eyes fixed on the door. Everyone was waiting for the next witness. They had already begun to look around at each other, wondering who it would be. And then, without any announcement or warning, the door simply opened and Will Smith walked in. It was one of those moments when you think, what on earth is going on? No one was expecting him. Not the journalists, not the audience, not even the judge himself. He literally choked with surprise. Smith came alone. No security, no lawyers, no entourage of stars that usually accompany celebrities. He just walked in as if it weren't a high-profile case, but a morning trip to the pharmacy. Until then, he had remained silent. Not a single comment. Not about the leaks, not in response to the rumors, not even after the publication of that very audio recording that made headlines all over the news. He remained stubbornly silent, as if none of it had happened. But now something had broken him, or angered him, or pushed him. Maybe he was tired of the gossip. Maybe he was fed up with someone's betrayal. Or maybe he finally listened to that recording and realized that silence was no longer working. Whatever it was, it forced him out of the shadows and into the spotlight. He stood at the witness stand calmly, without fuss. No show of confidence, no playing to the crowd. It was clear that he wasn't an actor on a movie set. He was just a man who was tired of putting up with it all. No poses, no familiar Hollywood smile. His voice was tired, his eyes determined. He didn't come to shine. He came to speak. The first thing he said confused even the prosecutor. It turned out that he had not received a summons to court. No one had summoned him, no one had asked him to come. It was his own decision to ask to speak. He simply came and said, "I want to speak." The judge, a little taken aback, allowed him to do so. And then it began. When he started talking, it was immediately clear that this was not a PR stunt, not a prepared speech, not another attempt to look good in front of the press. He wasn't rehearsing lines or trying to be dramatic. No, this was the monologue of a man who had been bottling things up inside for years and had finally decided to say everything. Unfiltered, unedited, no embellishments. His voice was steady, but everyone listening understood that behind those words lay years of pain, unspoken words, and silent anger. According to Will, it all started quite mundane. He was invited to a party for Diddy's birthday. So what, right? He had been to similar events before. Nothing special. Celebrities, small talk, champagne, DJs. But this time, from the very beginning, something felt off. Something was wrong. He felt it as soon as he walked in. The mansion stood somewhere in the hills, expensive, cut off from the outside world, as if specially chosen so that no one would accidentally wander in. There were security guards at the gate, not just a couple of bouncers, but serious guys in black uniforms with walkie-talkies and stern faces. Guests arrived in black SUVs with tinted windows, and right at the entrance, they confiscated our phones. No photos, no videos. Everything had to be handed over. No questions asked. If you wanted to go in, you had to leave your device behind. No? Turn around. And so he went in. Inside, it was even stranger. The lights were dimmed. The music wasn't exactly loud, but it had such a bass that it made his chest vibrate. Everything was arranged too selectively. Not a single random person. Everyone had either come with someone or been brought by someone. There were mirrors on the walls. Lots of mirrors. Too many. At first he thought it was a design choice, but the longer he was inside, the more he felt that these weren't just mirrors. They were more like hidden cameras. It was as if he was being watched, but by whom, he couldn't tell. No one was looking directly at him, but he could feel their gaze. The atmosphere was such that he wanted to be on his guard. He couldn't understand what exactly was wrong, but everything inside him told him not to relax. When Diddy approached him and said, "Now you're part of the family," Will initially took it as a figure of speech. After all, who knows what kind of phrases people like to use at parties like this? He decided that now there would be a conversation, maybe about business, maybe just a heart-to-heart, as sometimes happens between public figures. So when Diddy gestured for him to follow him into one of the rooms, Will followed without hesitation. He didn't yet know that behind that door it wasn't a business meeting or a friendly chat that awaited him, but something that, as he later said, made his insides clench. The room was deliberately decorated in a luxurious style, but it wasn't the furniture or the interior that immediately caught his attention. There were people there, men and women, some of whom he knew. He had seen them before, on screens, on magazine covers, at music awards. Some were very young, perhaps even too young. And it didn't look like a simple meeting or a get-together. It was more like a carefully staged scene, where some were participants and others were observers. And these observers sat, drank, smiled, some lazily commenting on what was happening. And Diddy, he laughed, as if everything that was happening was part of a normal, routine evening. As if nothing unusual was happening. As if this was the family that Will had now supposedly been accepted into. He stood in the middle of the room, stunned, not understanding what he had gotten himself into. The ostentatious merriment around him contrasted sharply with how he felt. Inside, he felt cold, afraid, and extremely anxious. And the worst part was that no one else in the room seemed surprised except him. After that evening, Will realized that he wasn't just at a strange party. He had fallen into a trap from which there was no easy way out. This wasn't like a typical celebrity gathering, where the main thing was to show up in front of the cameras and leave with a drink in your hand. Everything was different here. And it wasn't just the atmosphere. It was what lay beneath the surface. He had a strong desire to just disappear, forget everything he had seen, and never go near these people again. But after a couple of days, it became clear that he wouldn't be able to leave quietly. He got a call. The number was unknown, the voice unfamiliar, calm, almost cheerful. "Hope you had a good time, Fresh Prince," said the voice on the other end, and hung up. No explanation, no threats, just that one sentence, with a smirk between the lines. A day later, an envelope arrived. No return address, no signature. Inside was a regular flash drive. He plugged it in, and everything fell into place. The video was of that very night. He was sitting on the couch, talking, laughing, looking relaxed, as if under the influence of something. The camera was hidden, and the recording was clearly made without his knowledge. And then, at some point, a voice he recognized immediately came from off-camera. It was Diddy's voice. He said almost in a whisper, but clearly, "That's how we've got him." Everything became crystal clear. This wasn't just blackmail. It was a demonstration of power. The message, "You're ours now." It doesn't matter what you saw, what you understood, what you want to forget. What matters is what we have on you. And if you try to escape, this video could be made public. Or at the very least, it could end up in the right hands. From that moment on, Will realized that he had become part of something he never intended to be a part of, and that now his every move would be watched by someone. From that moment on, everything began to change. Not immediately, not dramatically, but consistently and noticeably. At first, it was small things. Will began receiving invitations to other private parties. The invitations didn't come directly, but through mutual acquaintances, agents, and PR managers. It seemed like just a continuation of his social life. But after that night, he knew for sure there were no coincidences here. He refused, time after time, politely, without scandal. But politeness didn't help for long. Soon problems began, problems that seemed unrelated but ultimately formed a very clear picture. Projects he had already been approved for fell through. Contracts were either suddenly canceled or began to hang without explanation. People who had recently called him a friend suddenly became busy or simply disappeared from his circle. His agent shook his head saying, "I don't understand what's going on." But he couldn't change anything. At the same time, a new wave of rumors began to spread on the internet. Some wrote that he was allegedly gay and was simply afraid to come out. Others said that he had serious mental health issues, was unstable, and unpredictable. Someone started a rumor that he was cheating on his wife with anyone he could get his hands on. Men, women, anyone. It all sounded absurd, but it worked. An image began to take shape in the public eye that had little to do with the real Will, but confidently replaced reality. That's when he realized this wasn't a chain of coincidences. It was a system, a well-thought-out, well-oiled machine designed to take down anyone who tried to break free. A mechanism that knew how to destroy public figures through rumors, isolation, and attacks on their reputation. According to him, Diddy never said anything directly. He never made direct threats. Everything was done through hints, jokes, half phrases, Everything was done by others: bloggers, producers, media agents. People who seemed to have no connection to each other began to speak and act in unison. It was as if someone had given a signal, and everyone who was in the know immediately understood that it was time to turn up the pressure. He recounted in detail one striking incident that happened to him in 2013. At that time, he had almost managed to sign a major contract with a well-known luxury brand, a serious deal that could have significantly raised his status and strengthened his career. He even had time to work on an advertising photo shoot. He was on set, posing in expensive clothes, and everything was going well. But suddenly, as if by magic, everything fell apart. The contract was abruptly canceled, without explanation or warning. Instead of joy and new opportunities, there was complete silence and closed doors. A couple of weeks later, he received another invitation to an event organized by Diddy. Will, remembering his previous experience, refused to go again. And then the real smear campaign began. Shortly after his refusal, he began receiving calls from unknown numbers which contained hints and threats. New rumors began to spread online, even dirtier and harsher than before. Someone was leaking information that was difficult to verify but damaged his reputation even more. The whole attack was a clear attempt to force him to submit and return to Diddy's family, or at least to shut him up for good. Will called it all psychological warfare. At first, he said it feels like you're just going crazy. The calls, the rumors, the pressure, everything hits you at once, and you don't understand what's going on or how to fight it. You feel alone and lost, as if they want to break you from the inside. But then, when you start to figure things out, you notice a pattern. It's not chaos, but a carefully constructed system. If you refuse, you get another blow. If you don't give up, the pressure only intensifies. Everything works like clockwork. One step to the side, and they immediately try to undermine you, ruin your reputation, or deprive you of the opportunity to work. These aren't just random misfortunes, but a targeted campaign aimed at silencing you. Will also said that he is not alone. He knows other stars who have gone through similar experiences but prefer to remain silent. The reasons vary. Some are afraid of the consequences, some have signed strict non-disclosure agreements, and some are simply not ready to lose everything they have built. It's like an invisible network that keeps many people in check, and it's difficult to break because the system is very cunning and well thought out. Then, in court, Will looked directly at Diddy and said, "You didn't just gather people, you controlled them." This statement was much more than just an accusation of organizing parties. It implied that there was an entire power structure that had a firm grip on almost all of Hollywood. It wasn't just a social circle, it was a structure through which all important decisions and opportunities passed. Will explained that without crossing paths with this circle, it was very difficult to advance in the industry. You were either in their system or you were out. To back up his words, he recalled a charity event in 2016. There, he saw influential figures from the film and music industries openly thank Diddy for a final version. It was a flash drive handed to him by the head of a major streaming platform. Will didn't reveal what was on that flash drive, but he made it clear that it was then that he realized how huge and cruel this control mechanism was. That moment was a revelation for him. The realization that behind the beautiful facade of the industry lay something much more complex and dangerous. Over time, Will began to notice something strange. Many famous people around him behaved as if they were being controlled from within. These weren't just Diddy's friends or casual acquaintances. They were people who had already gone through the system and survived, but seemed to have lost some of their freedom and independence in the process. Their actions, words, even their glances seemed programmed, subordinate to something greater, invisible but very powerful. He admitted that he had kept silent for 20 years, not because he didn't want to speak, but because he was simply afraid. The fear was so strong that it seemed better to remain silent and preserve at least the remnants of his career and life. But later he realized the terrible truth. He had already been written off. It happened quietly, without official statements or open conflicts, through a chain of rumors, project rejections, and colleagues distancing themselves from him. He was, as it were, excluded from the game without explanation and without a chance of return. The only thing that really helped him retain some hope was the support of the public, the audience, those who saw him not just as a star, but as a person with his own story. It was this support that became a kind of support and protection for him, counteracting all the pressure and control he faced. The turning point came when Will was informed that his voice could be heard on one of the audio recordings played in court. At first, he reacted to the news with disbelief. It seemed like some kind of mistake or forgery. But then, as he listened to the recording and analyzed what was happening, he was forced to accept reality. If it was really his voice, then everything he had gone through was not a figment of his imagination or paranoia, but real events. This realization was decisive for him. He understood that to remain silent would mean agreeing to the attempts to suppress and control him. He decided that he would no longer allow fear and pressure to dictate his life. From that moment on, he took responsibility for his words and began to speak openly about what had happened, despite all the risks and threats. He began to understand that these parties were not just harmless get-togethers where people gathered to have fun and relax. No, it was a carefully constructed system of control and manipulation, where everything, from the choice of location and time to the smallest details of the atmosphere, served a single purpose. At one point during one of these parties, the power was suddenly cut off. It looked like a simple technical glitch, but he quickly realized that it was far from accidental. The power outage created a feeling of helplessness and vulnerability, as if you were being shown that you were not the master of this space, but an object that could be controlled and manipulated. I was told that I had become one of the victims of this system, deliberately targeted to be suppressed, intimidated, and kept in line. It was part of a larger plan where every element worked to create an atmosphere of fear and submission. Not just threats with words or actions, but the creation of conditions in which people begin to doubt themselves, their abilities, and whether they are being heard or supported. But the hardest blow for me was not fear. It was always there, serving as a constant backdrop. The turning point came when I felt a deep sense of humiliation. It's not just the feeling that you are feared or threatened. It's the realization that someone is trying to break you, to silence you, to erase your identity and dignity. And then I suddenly realized if I don't tell the truth now, my silence will become my legacy. My children and grandchildren will have to read the headlines in newspapers and online articles, hear the gossip and speculation, and I won't be able to live with that. This realization turned everything inside me upside down. I realized that I could no longer allow fear to control me. If I remain silent, I become an accomplice to this system. If I don't tell the truth, I will surrender my fate and the fate of my loved ones into the hands of those who want to maintain power through lies and fear. I had to speak out, not for myself, but for those who would come after me, for the truth and justice that had been hidden for too long. This decision was not just a choice for me, but a challenge. To step out of the shadows, stop being a victim, and give people the opportunity to learn what really happened behind closed doors. He took a step that seemed impossible to many. Without any prompting, pressure, or outside interference, he called the prosecution team himself and calmly, with confidence in his voice, said, "I'm ready. Ask me anything you want, I'll answer." That was the moment he stopped hiding and decided to take control of his story. He knew it would be difficult, that the questions would be painful, but silence was no longer an option for him. He told the jury candidly that his silence was not simply a desire to remain in the shadows or a fear of telling the truth. He had been deceived, set up and filmed without his consent. These videos were used to manipulate and pressure him. It wasn't just a game, it was a systematic attempt to destroy him as a person and as a professional. He looked directly at Diddy, and his gaze was clearly sharp and accusatory. He made it clear that Diddy was well aware of the consequences of his actions and had deliberately orchestrated them. At one point, Will closed his eyes for a moment as if gathering his strength and taking a deep breath to remember and recount what he had kept inside for so long, trying to forget. It wasn't just a return to painful memories. It was an internal struggle to overcome fear and shame. When the court asked if he wanted to listen to one of the key audio recordings in which his voice could be heard, he admitted that at first he had serious doubts. It was scary to hear himself on that recording, to relive everything and admit that all those terrible things had really happened. However, he realized that he could no longer avoid it. He had to face the truth and confirm it with facts. So he agreed. The recording was played in the courtroom, but behind closed doors, without the press or the jury. Only the judge, the lawyers, and Will himself were present. It was an intimate and tense atmosphere where every sound and every word on the recording carried enormous weight. For Will, it was the moment of truth, when all the truth hidden in the shadows came out, and he could no longer back down. This episode was a turning point in the case and in his own life. There was no longer any room for fear and doubt, only determination to speak out and fight for justice. He heard himself laugh, but it wasn't the laugh that usually came from him. It was a hollow, foreign sound, as if he were drunk or under the influence of something strong. This laugh did not reflect his true self. It sounded false, like an echo of who he did not want to be. He described the atmosphere on the recording in detail: quiet music, rare voices, isolated exclamations, creating a feeling of anxiety and tension, as if something was hiding in the shadows. Suddenly, he heard Diddy's voice. He was saying something like, "That's how we break them." The words sounded like a sentence, a demonstration of power and control. And then he heard his name, and it sounded in the most humiliating and terrifying contexts. It wasn't just unpleasant or hurtful. It was awful because the recording stripped him of his humanity, turning him into an object of manipulation and humiliation. For the first time ever, Will's voice faltered. He lowered his eyes, paused as if gathering his strength, and then continued. He had never consented to the recording, never agreed to participate in what was happening on it. But the recording was made and kept anyway, perhaps to be used for their own purposes, or perhaps simply to have something to hold over him, as a means of pressure. For many years, he couldn't understand why he had sudden bouts of anxiety and panic attacks from time to time, especially during interviews and in public places. Now, listening to the recording and remembering those events, he realized that it wasn't his weakness or madness. These were vivid memories that he had tried to bury deep inside and forget, but which kept coming back, destroying him from within. Listening to the recording was a real shock for him, not only because of what he heard, but also because of what he didn't remember. All the manipulation, preparation, and betrayal by the people who were close to him, who watched and remained silent, came to the surface. The worst part was realizing that much of what had happened had simply been erased from his memory, as if he had experienced a real break with reality. He looked straight at the jury and said, "If you want to understand how powerful Diddy is, ask yourself, how could a man like me be intimidated for 20 years and not even realize it?" When his testimony hit the media, Hollywood's reaction was immediate and intense. Before the official recess, clips from the trial spread across the internet at lightning speed. Hashtags, memes, and discussions literally blew up social media. Will was no longer just a famous star. He was a man who had lived through a real nightmare, and his story touched many people. He spoke honestly about how he understood that once he spoke out, everything would go haywire. But he didn't anticipate how quickly it would happen. The storm of events and changes began almost immediately after the truth came out, turning not only his life upside down, but the entire industry around him. In the first 24 hours after his candid testimony, everything around him began to collapse at a staggering speed. He lost 2 major advertising contracts that had previously seemed like a stable foundation and an opportunity to maintain his image. These brands quickly distanced themselves from him, fearing the negative consequences of the scandal. But that was only the first blow. The studio that was preparing to release a film starring him, a project in which he had invested a lot of effort and hope, froze all promotional activities without warning. Advertising campaigns were halted, premieres were postponed, and promotion seemed to freeze in the cold. For many, this might have seemed like a disaster, but Will saw it differently. He had already lost something far more important: his voice, his ability to speak and be heard without fear. Soon after, a stream of quiet calls and messages began. These contacts were not public. They came as if from the shadows, from those who do not usually speak out in public. Among the callers were actors, producers, directors, people who might have been close before but had remained silent. Some expressed gratitude that he had decided to speak out, acknowledging that the industry was long overdue for exposure. But there were others, those who issued veiled warnings and threats. Phrases like, "You don't know who you're dealing with," and "You've made yourself radioactive," sounded like cold arrows, trying to silence him and send him back into the shadows. It was a subtle but clear sign that power and fear were still trying to hold him back. Will mentioned a few names but refused to reveal any details. Legal restrictions and the risk of new lawsuits forced him to keep his mouth shut. But the hint was clear. The roots of the problem went far beyond Diddy, to the very core of an industry built on silence, secrets, and deals with conscience, where people traded silence like currency and compromising information and secrets became tools of control. He suggested that others in the system also have dirt on him, something they can use to crush him and break him again. Moreover, he warned that new videos could soon emerge, carefully crafted to portray him in a bad light, broken, unstable, untrustworthy. But despite all the threats and pressure, he made it clear that he was not there to defend his reputation or justify himself. His goal was to defend the truth. He intended to continue the fight and speak out despite all the obstacles because he understood that silence would allow the system to continue operating. And he was no longer willing to be a part of it. He understood from the outset that his high-profile statements could lead to accusations and attempts to blame him. But he asked a simple and logical question. If he had lied or made up the whole story, why risk it now after so many years of silence? It was his challenge and proof of his sincerity. At the end of his testimony, he said the words that became the motto of his fight. The truth comes late, but it always comes loud. Addressing Diddy directly, he accused him of creating an empire of fear, manipulation, and destruction of people for his own pleasure and gain. To better convey his point to the jury, he showed an old photograph of people from that very party. Will explained that the problem was not just one incident. It was systemic, silencing everyone for fear of the consequences. He concluded his speech by saying that Diddy was the best liar there was and calmly left the courtroom. At that moment, Diddy was pale, tense, and clearly lost control of the situation. Will did not look like a victor. Rather, he looked like a man who had stopped running and finally decided to face the truth head-on. After the trial, Hollywood was in shock. Deals were canceled, rumors spread, videos and memes exploded on the internet, and fans actively supported Will. In response, he posted an old photo with a simple caption expressing pride and inner strength, a sign that he had not broken. Will's testimony became a catalyst that set off a chain of new revelations in the industry. He is now focused on rebuilding his life, trying to heal and move forward for the first time in a long time. The court recognized his courage, and the era of silence seems to be coming to an end.